Mr. President, I'd like to make another statement, a separate place in the record.
Without objection.
Mr. President, last Friday night was an amazing evening. I went to the Fellowship Missionary Baptist Church on the south side of Chicago, not too far from where the White Sox play baseball. And there was a Friday night memorial service for the longtime pastor of that church, Reverend Clay Evans. He actually divided his service up and said Friday nights for the politicians and government people. Saturday morning will be the memorial service for the members of my church. But a lot of people showed up on Friday night because a lot of us considered Clay Evans to be a friend. He was more than a friend, he was a legend. The Reverend Clay Evans died peacefully at his home the day before Thanksgiving at the age of 94. Let me tell you a little bit about him. If you ever had the good fortune to witness the Reverend Dr. Clay Evans preach, you were lucky. With his rousing sermons, his soulful baritone voice, and the ship, which is what he called the legendary Fellowship Missionary Baptist Church choir behind him, Reverend Evans was mesmerizing. His sermons gave hope to the downhearted. His singing could bring you to your feet. His Sunday services were so moving and so uplifting that the legendary Sam Cooke used to come and attend for inspiration. Even in Chicago, the birthplace of modern black gospel music, the home of Mahalia Jackson, James Cleveland, Mavis Staples, and so many others, Reverend Clay Evans stood out for the power of his preaching. But it wasn't just his beautiful voice that drew people in. Clay Evans was a man of faith, integrity, and moral courage. In the 1960s, he helped persuade Dr. Martin Luther King to come to Chicago and use it as his base as Dr. King sought to expand the civil rights movement. It was not a popular position at the time, believe me. Chicago power brokers, fearful of the unrest in the streets, warned black ministers, don't let Dr. King into your churches. Many of them listened to that warning and turned him away. Not Clay Evans. He invited Dr. King to speak at his church. He opened the doors of his ship to Operation Breadbasket, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference Economic Justice Project. Then he persuaded other Chicago ministers and churches to join him. He paid a price for it. Offers of loans, construction loans he needed to build his church were withdrawn when he made this controversial decision. Building permits were withheld for several years. But Chicago, over time, became more just, thanks to the work of Reverend Evans, Dr. Martin Luther King, and the man whom he ordained, Reverend Evans ordained, the Reverend Jesse Jackson, and many others. Operation Breadbasket helped to open up thousands of jobs for black Chicagoans in previously all-white grocery chains and companies. Years ago, Reverend Evans told a Chicago Tribune reporter, I try to embody the principles of Christianity, and for me that means being dedicated to freedom and equality. For him, faith was not just what you believed, it's the way you lived. Clay Evans, born in 1925, large church-going family in Brownsville, Tennessee. His family were sharecroppers. He was one of 9 kids. At night, he liked to listen to jazz music on the radio. He moved to Chicago in 1945, part of the Great Migration that has enriched that city in so many ways. The most successful man he knew in Brownsville, Tennessee, was an undertaker, and that's what Clay Evans thought he would become in Chicago. But he couldn't afford the tuition for mortuary school, so he took jobs where he found them. He worked at a pickle factory as a window washer, drove a truck delivering pies. He was working at a brass rail cocktail lounge in downtown Chicago when they prompted him to join in song and marveled at his voice. He might have been a successful nightclub performer, but he felt called to the ministry. He attended the Chicago Baptist Institute and was ordained a Baptist minister in 1950. He would later study at both the Northern Baptist Theological Seminary and the University of Chicago Divinity School. He founded the Fellowship Missionary Baptist Church in 1958 and served as pastor for 42 years. He used radio and later TV to bring his ministry to homes throughout the Midwest and South and to introduce black gospel music to the nation. Fellowship Missionary Baptist Church, or the SHIP as it's affectionately known, quickly became one of the most influential churches in Chicago. He helped launch the careers of nearly 90 up-and-coming young ministers, including Mother Consuela York, the first woman to be ordained a Baptist minister in the city of Chicago. He ordained the Reverend Jesse Jackson, and in 1971, the two ministers co-founded Operation Push to encourage African-American self-help. Carved into his wooden pulpit was one of his favorite sayings, It's no secret what God can do. What God did through his servant Clay Evans helped to increase hope and justice in Chicago and far beyond. I remember when, as a downstate congressman, I made my early trips to Chicago to meet the movers and the shakers. Reverend Clay Evans was high on that list, and as luck would have it, at one of the dinners we were seated next to one another. And he leaned over to me. I knew exactly who he was, but he leaned over to me and he said, "Congressman, I'm Reverend Clay Evans." I said, "That's not what I heard. I heard you're Reverend Chicago." And he laughed and he looked down and he said, "Well, they call me that from time to time." That's the kind of respect which he commanded, not just because of his ministry, but also because he was such an integral part of the faith scene in that great city. We got to be friends, and I was always looking forward to times we could get together. With a choir led by his sister, Lou Della Evans Reed, Pastor Evans produced and recorded over 40 gospel albums, 11 that charted on, and 2 that topped the Billboard Gospel Albums chart. His first #1 gospel hit was called "I'm Going Through," released in 1993. The title song talks about staying on the righteous road no matter how steep the climb, how large the obstacles. Reverend Evans would sing, I'm going through no matter what they may do. The world behind, heaven in view, I'm going through." Reverend Clay Evans walked that righteous road. He overcame obstacles and widened the road so others could follow. He is certainly going to be missed, and the crowd of speakers Friday night is just evidence of the many lives that he touched. My wife Loretta and I want to offer our condolences to his wife of nearly 74 years, Lutha May, their children, their grandchildren, their great-grandchildren, and all of those in the family of Clay Evans who will try to maintain a warm smile at a time of sadness for many of them. But what he has left behind is something that we will all point to for years to come. Mr. President, I yield the floor.